this is not something that happened in 2005. You go back and look at N.T. Ramarao's programs of basic needs. Economists like Bhaskar Datta and others have studied that the targeting was much better. It was not certainly something that was born in 2005. They were committed officers. They were working. These people are not in the news like Rahul. They do the work on the ground. And politicians win elections. When N.T. Ramarao's program was implemented successfully, it came with a lot of fiscal burden. And apart from a few departments like rural development and a few others, civil supplies, all the others opposed. And these fiscal constraints became a very important political factor when Chandrababu Naidu came to power. So Chandrababu Naidu was very happy if the rural development guys did a lot of good work, but with less money. And under those circumstances, a man called Mr. Raju actually converted funds from the National Literacy Mission, and that's another legendary story in the district of Nellore, to promote literacy and women's literacy. And out of this idea of the literacy program and the banning of liquor, there arose what is a very long story of the self-help groups in Andhra Pradesh, which are now very well known in the rest of the country. So all of this was studied, practiced under the UNDP-funded South Asia Poverty Alleviation Program. Then subsequently, Mr. Raju became the CEO of a World Bank-funded Society for the Elimination of Poverty. And all of these experiments helped the Rural Development Department to understand how to create women's self-help groups. It helped them understand how to reach financial benefits directly to people who benefit from those things, and brought women out of their houses, made them sort of working people, so that, next slide, so that by the time we are in 2005, when the National Advisory Council and the Parliament, they have passed these rights-based legislations. We are inhabited in a world where the learnings of the self-help groups were available to bureaucrats in the Rural Development Department. Also, the limits of the self-help group model were available to the bureaucrats in Andhra Pradesh, because it was very clear that self-help groups for women was not targeting the poorest of the poor families. It was more like a microcredit type of program. But they had learned how to mobilize women, and they had also, through experiments with NABARD, understood how to create a linkage between the bank and the self-help. So what happens now is that when Mr. Rajshekar Reddy became Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, like every other Chief Minister, he was very skeptical about a programmatic implementation of economics, because there was a food for work program that Chandrababu Naidu had implemented. It was very highly corrupt, and those corruption sagas had not helped Mr. Chandrababu Naidu in politics. So Mr. Rajshekar Reddy actually, to begin with, had this idea that what if I fall into the trap of Naidu? But what is interesting is that Mr. Y.S. Rajshekar Reddy was a very politically grounded politician. He had done a lot of padiyatras. And his close synergy with the bureaucratic class, who had actually gotten some DFID funding, formed themselves into a strategic group that would make a proposal that would convince a very politically aspirational. This is sort of the nutshell of this. It was not like Rajshekar Reddy said, let us implement NREGS, Raju do it like this. No. Raju and company with DFID funding formed the strategic group. They worked overnight to see what are the critical questions that the Chief Minister will ask. And that was a very politically grounded. So he could actually ask very critical. And I can give you other stories of Rajshekar Reddy. Rajshekar Reddy knew his constituencies very well. That proposal which the RD made the chief minister, was convincing. And now it is very well known, what was in those proposals. So first and foremost, they set up social audit. Now we all know that Andhra Pradesh social audit is legendary. I can take it on. It was began with experiments of MKSS, and then an MKSS activist was made the director of the social audit office. The IAS officer was taken away. It was a very interesting kind of an institutional innovation, where the director of the social audit office only wanted to work as a consultant and not even as a regular permanent employee of the government. And that was accepted. The second important innovation was that TCS produced a complementary software which would track the movement of funds from Hyderabad to the world, largely bypassing the panchayats. So the panchayat would be involved, but they put up a man called a field assistant in every village, which would be like the lowest level of the bureaucracy, which technically in consultation with the panchayat to bring the project to the village. But practically, the field assistant was actually doing a lot of work. And therefore, the bureaucracy had a lot of control over how these projects will go to the village. It had a lot of control to see that the money is actually directly paid to the worker, ran through the panchayat. And in this manner, a large number of innovations were put in place, which produced the trajectory in Andhra Pradesh. What was very interesting about West Bengal is that in the state of West Bengal, where the communists were in power, and we have papers on both these states, we found that the policy paradigm in West Bengal had actually moved from redistribution much more in the direction of trickle-down economics. So people like Buddhadev Bhattacharya and others were willing to put far more political capital into getting a nano into West Bengal than into actually redistributing money to the poor. And I can give you numerous examples of how this can be shown. We've done sort of district level work on this. And the result of that was, in fact, in one of the papers, this paper in Indian Politics and Policy, one of the co-authors is Manav Roy, who was the Principal Secretary of Rural Development in West Bengal when the program failed. And we also had a lot of. So what happened here was, and clearly to show how the policy paradigm, to give you some examples. Suryakanta Mishra, the legendary land reforms guy, 1977, was removed from the land reform ministry, and a cipher was put in. The chief minister never showed the kind of interest that you would have expected, right? And even with committed bureaucrats, even with some committed, people at the district and the block level, because NREG is a class conflict. You have to basically take on the land in order to give the wages to the poor. It's not a simple matter. So when I started my conversation with Mr. Manav Roy, he would say, oh, in West Bengal we have monsoons, we have so many things, therefore, we could not implement. I said, sir, you have monsoons for 365 days a year. You're only going to pay 100 days, right? So it took me about 2 months for him to come out clean. But after 2 months, he says, yes, Rahul, you're right. Our CM was not good. And you can't implement NREGS unless your CM is interested. Because it's a bloody difficult program. It's almost like land reform. You have to take on the landed class. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me that this program has not succeeded in Bihar. Because the landed class here is probably even more powerful. So I hope I have made some sort of interjections for you to be somewhat convinced. You can now move on to the last. That policy ideas are important. It is not like NREGS happens because the poor people rise and they suddenly want redistribution. No, there was no social movement like that. communists under CPIM, that's a much more complicated story. There was Nazism, there were other things. But in recent times, when I just presented, let's say, West Bengal in Calcutta, both Shuddhakanta Mishra and Professor Patna said, but how, the gardens got polluted. This was the time of finance capital, and therefore, we could not implement. I said, you talk about finance capital in West Bengal, then what about finance capital in Andhra Pradesh? You're like peanuts compared to Andhra Pradesh, right? I mean, what is the investment that you have? Andhra Pradesh competes more with Malaysia, and you compete with Bihar. So, where are you? I mean, if finance capital is your independent variable, then there is much more finance capital in Andhra Pradesh than there is in West Bengal. And they had no answer. So recently I found that Professor Bharta has also started citing, because he's a good scholar. He has to take it with some. Now I really don't have the time to talk about politics right now, and I very well understand that this is an institute that works more in the area of economics than in the area of politics. So I don't want to bore you with political topics, but you can take a similar position in the area of politics as well, as you can see in this diagram. I have divided the current ideational milieu as attacks on pluralistic society and attacks on pluralistic state. And I have divided this into 3 categories. And these categories are not mine. These are very well-established categories in historical history. One is institutional drift. Institutional drift happens when you want to pursue an idea by just interpreting laws and policies with it. You don't have to make any policy changes. So it's the same parliament, but it legislates very differently. It doesn't use standing committees. It is the same Supreme Court, but it has not heard the case on electoral bonds. And it is the same constitution, but we are being told that fiscal federalism is being attacked. Similarly, the current Contribution Regulation Act, which is now very well known because of what people have made it out to be, was of course used in a very negative way under the UPA regime. But the manner in which it is being used today, the FCRA of 2010, is significantly different. It is far more threatening for non-governmental organizations. I'm not trying to excuse the Congress Party. I think they did commit the original sin. I know a little bit about the legal aspects of the original sin. I can talk about it. But I can also argue that the way in which it is being used today is significantly different. And that is why I will call it institutional drift. Similarly, media freedoms are being curbed without any significant change in law. Like I published 2 very subversive pieces in the Hindu, one on the 27th of July and one on the 11th of August. And I was very surprised that a newspaper could publish those 2 pieces. But notwithstanding that, there are not many newspapers that can publish such pieces. And perhaps it is because I wrote the 2 pieces that they were published, because one attacked Mr. Modi and the other attacked the Gandhi. So I think I kind of squared the circle, and maybe Hindu thought it was politically correct. That was not my reason for writing the pieces. The second mode of attack, the second instrument of attack is layering. Institutional layering happens, and I mentioned layering a little bit, but I didn't define it very well. When you actually make gradual overt changes in laws and policies, but very gradual. Layering happened in the direction of deregulation in the 1980s in India. Similarly, the FCRA of 2020 is layering. It builds a layer on the 2010 Act. It's not a radical change, but it's a layer. PM Cares is also a layer of change on the idea of the Prime Minister's. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, also I would call it a layer of change, because the UPA government had already done a lot of this during their tenure. And this is another layer which actually makes it easy for somebody to be called a terrorist without enough proof. In the earlier situation, you needed to be connected to a group. Today, they can just say that, Rahul Mukherji is a terrorist. Nothing can be done about it, right? The Citizenship Amendment Act also is, you can say that it is layering, because a lot of things that look like the Citizenship Amendment Act are already happening. Of course, the Citizenship Amendment Act legalizes certain things that were not explicitly done in the past. Similarly, with regard to attacks on the pluralistic nature of the state, I would say electoral bonds is a layering thing, because there was enough in the electoral funding of elections in India, which is a problem. But electoral bonds raises it to another level. Like, I can argue why electoral bonds actually makes it much more easy to make election funding more open and advantages the ruling party in many ways. The farm bills of 2020, I would argue, if they had succeeded, it would have been a displacement of, because it's almost a completely different idea. I mean, bring it or not, different. But the farm bills were actually a very radical move, which the resilient farmers movement tackled, so it did not succeed. Similarly, the abrogation of Article 370, I would say, is a displacement, because it displaces the idea that a Muslim majority state should have a special status, with the idea that the Muslim majority state should not only not have a special state, it should not even have an ordinary state. It should become a union territory. So it's a huge displacement. So I am just putting for your consideration the fact that, one can argue about policy paradigm in economics, but one can also argue about policy paradigm in politics, right? I mean, why do you need a Supreme Court that could cancel all the 144 licenses that have? Why not have a Supreme Court that doesn't even hear the 2G scam, or the electoral bonds case, or the abrogation of Article 70 case? That means you don't need checks and balances. The executive can rule. Similarly, why do you need a society that has different types of NGOs? Just have one type of NGO that believes in one kind of international, and use the UAPA, PMLA, and DFCR to curb other types of NGOs, including opposition parties. Right? Now, it's not a question of being right or wrong. And it might very well be that the Indian population actually begins to buy this idea. I don't think this idea was born because there was a lot of funding for this idea. I think the idea has grown and steady. And of course, after it has grown, a lot of funding has also come for electoral bonds, for RSS shakas, for a variety of such. So I think with that, I want to humbly put for your consideration this argument or this thesis, that I'm not trying to argue that classes don't matter. I'm not trying to argue. I think Pranav wrote a brilliant book. The classes matter. The Ambanis are powerful. The Adanis are getting more powerful. They will have. I'm not making that argument, but I am making the argument that if you really want to understand institutional change, just don't look at class. Look at how ideas change. If you're really looking at the extraordinary capacity of the state to do something, poke a little bit into how people thought and work out those. And maybe your work on Bihar either contradicts this understanding of political economy, or maybe contributes to. So I will now leave the floor for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mukherji. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mukherji. In a span of 50 minutes. That was a huge canvas that we have covered. We are all aware of the facts dimension, but never had a chance to arrange those facts to be from that we are done in this lecture. I am, of course, local. I have no idea whatsoever political science. I don't know. But as far as economics is concerned, I think there hasn't been changing so-called paradigm. Except for the initial years of planning, first plan, second plan, third plan, 70s onwards. Both UP, Congress as well as BJP Congress, and more or less the same economic paradigm in which they have been functioning. And the weaker points of those paradigm is becoming stronger over the years. It is difficult to find a model which is, is free of all kinds of limitation. Some limitation will always be there, but unfortunately, over the years, the limitations of the model are becoming more common than the goodness of the model. But certain kind of uniformity, 70s onwards, I'm taking 50s, 60s away from the 70s onwards have been there. Anyway, sorry for this long comment. Friends, you are most welcome to ask questions to Professor Mukherji. A few questions from there on. What is simple?
First, if in this group,
Hi, Dr. Rahul. I am Kauslendra, working with an NGO. This is regarding MGNREGA implementation in Bihar. That is something you talked about, like this is the conflict between two class, landowners and labor class. I just want to ask you from what you must have said and reading a lot of different, how much you will attribute into the governance or administrative capability of the state? Because at the grassroots level, capability of the state to make the plan, to make steps, how much you will attribute to those steps?
Can I answer? Yeah, so I take one question at a time so that the focus is not lost. Professor Mukherji.
Yeah, what I'm trying to argue is that so it's a very pertinent question, administrative capacity. In fact, I was presenting just the NREGS research at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library when both Santosh Mathew, who was ADRI secretary here, and K. Raju were in the audience. And after listening to me, Santosh said that Rahul, I figured out why Raju was when I was on. So that is where, when I said merit, coherence, and imperatives. Right? So I spent a lot of time trying to argue from a Bavarian perspective that there are more and less capable bureaucratic arms. And the more and less capable bureaucratic arms have follow a certain Bavarian ideal type. That's your question, right? But the point is that even that is not necessary. Let's say Mr. Raju had Chandrababu, he would not have been able to implement that. Manav Roy with Buddhadev Bhattacharya could not implement the program in West Bengal. It was not like Manav Roy was not, Manav Roy was far more committed. He did the literacy promotion in Medipur as district magistrate when Shukrapal Mishra was the Panchayat president of Indore. So the point you made is very, very important. Bureaucratic capacity. But bureaucratic capacity is necessary, it's not sufficient. And the ability of the state to think is also a part of that bureaucratic capacity. So, I would have arguments with bureaucrats in West Bengal that their ability to think about how to perform reforms was very backward. compared to New Delhi or Andhra Pradesh or Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu. So I very respectfully take that point. But then if you know that this is a problem, then you can try to work at it. So it's not like the RD department of Andhra Pradesh was gone like that. There were civil servants who wanted sort of nurtured. But I agree with you. I mean, it could be just the fact that the department doesn't. Maybe some departments in Bihar have a better capacity, they have a better legacy. Some departments in Bihar don't. I mean, I'm sure you can actually compare bureaucracies even within a state, because many other things remain constant. But the question that you raise is a very important one. And I'm not trying to say that those things are not important. But what I'm trying to say is that it's also very important that with those attributes, what does the state think? So with regard to, for example, the 1991 reforms, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, as the Principal Secretary of the Prime Minister, visited Malaysia with Prime Minister VP Singh. Mr. VP Singh was astonished to see Malaysia. Because all these things, people think that Southeast Asian countries, they are less intelligent people. They will see something inferior. No, it's a surprise that there are clear roads, high literacy levels, everything is clean. And so VP Singh said, one day, how can we get India to this level? So this is already in his backstage book, but it is also in my book, which was published first before backstage. So Montek actually said, Prime Minister, we know how to do this. If you don't do it, then after some time, we will have to do it in collaboration with the World Bank. We know how to do this. Now, this is an answer to your question. Those guys are very smart. They know it. Question of political will. Right? Mr. VP Singh will never come out in the open and say that he's a pro-growth guy. Until his death, he will never do it. Even Narasimha Rao didn't do it. He made it look like Manmohan Singh. But if you are an insider, you would know how much Mr. Narasimha Rao actually supported it. So the point I'm trying to make is that bureaucratic capacity, even if it is there, you can't do anything. If the political will is not there. So Mr. Ahluwalia wrote a confidential memo which was leaked to the press. It is called the Infamous MTIP. And if you read that memo, you will find that India did all the things, most of the things that were in that memo. And we were not under any World Bank IMF compulsion at that time. So that makes you understand that these guys, and that's why Joseph Stiglitz says that when you say Washington consensus, this, that, and the other, all the things that you say about many other countries don't work for India. Because India had the technocratic ability to run what is called a heterodox program, which the Washington consensus accepted, but there are many things that were not pushed in the Washington consensus, like with trade unions, with small scale industry, with fertilizer subsidies. There were many things that were not implemented. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry to. So I have thank you for this wonderful talk. It was really very, very interesting from the point of view of an economist. We are always looking for exogenous policy changes. In that context, I have a very quick question. One for clarification for that matter. So, like you say about political will, about different political leaders adhering to certain leaders, but if we look at our current political scenario with the switching and of parties and horse trading happening between MLAs, so do you think that there is also a shift there where the leaders are instead of adhering to a particular belief, they are or see politicians as people working for the same or particular sort of ideology, they are working for themselves, so for their own personal benefits. So if we look at politicians like that, how would the theorization change in this model? And second question was about the economic reforms. Like you said that there was particular um, particular things that were happening in India, and it led to a tipping point. But then during the same time, similar reforms happened across the world, like Latin America, Southeast Asia, North Africa. All of them did similar policies, which it does seem that it was not in isolation. There are some international events that go on which kind of forces your national policy as well. So how does this fit into your?
I think both are excellent questions. So the first question is, have politicians become more selfish? I don't think politicians have become more selfish. They have always been selfish. The question is, what do selfish politicians want to do? I mean, it's not like Rajshekhar Reddy was a very charitable guy. He was just convinced that this type of service delivery in programmatic ways would succeed. Many other politicians would not take that route. I'll give you an example. When I was doing my research on, I wrote a paper for the World Bank, published. I interviewed the rural development minister. He was not in favor of NRE. But the chief minister was so powerful that the rural development minister was just remain on your seat. You don't have to wait. And all the other ministers, like the agriculture minister, was very opposed to reforms. So they were equally properly given subsidies. And, it is not like Rajshekhar Reddy. Rajshekhar Reddy was convinced by Raju's argument. But that has both the agency of Reddy and Raju's department. Because if you don't have a guy like Reddy, for example, let's say Rahul Gandhi was like Raju, the Congress party would be winning all the elections. Because I'm using it as a metaphor, because he does a lot of padya. And I can tell you stories about, I had debates with him where I thought I was right. Later on, when I went to the village, I found that Rajshekhar Reddy was right. I debated with him in the chief minister's office, and he was laughing at me, and I was laughing at him. He was a good man. He didn't kill me. But when I went to the village, I found the man actually knew what was happening on the ground, and I was persuaded more by the elite. So this is a very different kind of politician. When I said that a grounded politician, I was not making that statement. So what does a grounded politician mean? A grounded politician means he has to win elections. He can be rational. But if he has to win elections, there can still be two paradigms. There can be a clientelism paradigm that I will satisfy these groups, and there can be a programmatic paradigm that I will give it to everyone. Upper caste, lower caste, Hindu, Muslim, backward caste. So in an NREGS worksite, the backward caste and the Dalits were working together. This became legendary, right? Lots of people. So I am not arguing for or against selfishness. It may be that today, Mr. Modi, either because he is much more got into what the industrial class wants, or for whatever reasons, he doesn't want to globalize the economy. And even people like Panagaria have started writing about it. Amrita Nandikar, who works on trade policy, has written a piece on that. It's not very clear, but people like Devashish Mitro, I think Panagaria, they've all started. Panagaria and Bhagwati love Modi, right? Even they have started writing. What is he doing? Why is he, Now, that is because it may be that his paradigm is shifted. And he doesn't think, if he has to favor Adani and Ambani, and I don't know Modi's government that well. But that does not mean that he has become less or more selfish. Nehru did not do import substituting industrialization because he was not rational. He thought that was the best way for India to go. And he gave good reasons for it. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, if by that devaluation and by abolishing industrial licensing and by raising the foreign investment limit and by taking away industrial licensing, if they were not being not rational, they were being rational and selfish. So the point I'm trying to make is, what is it that you want? Do you want a Hindu Rashtra? Do you want a secular state? Do you want?
Let us take the second question.
The second question is again a very important question.
Yes.
And And the second question is, the answer to the second question is that, the answer to the second question is that India was looking at East Asia. India was looking at China. And India was not looking at China or East Asia to become East Asia or China. So, I have a piece in a special issue of the Review of International Political Economy, which says BRICS and the Washington Consensus. So somebody's talked about the New Delhi Consensus, somebody's talked about the Beijing Consensus, somebody has talked about the South African Consensus. Of course, there was pressure from Washington, no question about that. Of course, all of these people were enamored about, but the way in which we did our structural reforms is very different from the way in which the Chinese did it, or the way in which the South Koreans or the Pakistanis did it. And if you want to understand that difference, then you have to go to the endogenous groups. But certainly, when technocrats think, and even think endogenously, they are looking at how policies work in other places. But they don't just mimic those policies, they do it in a somewhat different way. So I don't think that if technocrats are persuaded to think because of things happening in other parts of the world, it necessarily makes it substantially exogenous. Because the consensus in New Delhi was not the consensus in Washington, or the consensus in Beijing. Deng Xiaoping was enamored by Singapore, but he didn't produce a Singapore. Right? So from that perspective, there is, I will not at all. I can tell you that Mrs. Gandhi was enamored by especially from some of the early 1980s. You don't know, but the first major telecom restructuring committee was a 1981 committee. It was an H.C. Sarin committee. Of course, some of India's technocrats in the past have been very smart. And if you look at some of those reports, you will be surprised how much India wanted to do when and when it got done. But there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of discussion. And this debate, this discussion, this opposition, in my view, is a good thing. Because disaster doesn't happen, and you also don't suddenly grow and have a family. That's the kind of model of deliberation.
Any other? Yes, Aditya.
Sir, my name is Aditya. I'm a student of sociology, and I really enjoyed this discussion, your lecture on the trajectory of ideas, galvanizing into policy paradigm changes, where you have talked about how stars in the network, especially the bureaucracy, or the political will makes an impact. I'm just thinking maybe you can throw some more light on the engagement with the public, the role of the civil society. How about the community? Are we just taking them as new players? So, thank you.
Yeah, this particular aspect actually needs further development. And I think my research, one of the shortcomings of my research, has so far been sort of lack of engagement with the other actors that actually, because sometimes these technocrats work very closely with civil society organizations, with institutions. I think in the narrow case of economic reforms, I think the state matters more. In the broader case of welfare politics, I think non-governmental action is much more important because, Raju cannot make use of a national literacy mission to produce so many literates all by himself. He has to take the help of a lot of NGOs. I would say that we need to explore much more this role. I have had deliberations with people, but having said that, I would still argue that. So, for example, look at the National Advisory Council. So, Mr. Harsh Mandar would tell me many stories about how he would debate with Dr. Manmohan Singh. Dr. Manmohan Singh was a new liberal. He didn't believe in a lot of these rights. And he was both powerful and technical, right? So sometimes he would get impacted by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who would provide the political power behind, let's say, a less market-driven approach, right? So in the National Advisory Council, they were all there. Aruna Roy, Nikhil Dey, all of these people. So I take your point very seriously. In fact, research that we are doing on EMLA, I'm trying to bring civil society much more into my understanding of democratic politics, and it's a very important question. But and I would say that there is some ignorance in relation to, let's say, welfare politics, but the state is still very important. Without the state, it doesn't happen. And in the case of, I think, economic reforms, I think the steel arm of the state is a little more important. And in the case of, I mean, that is my fairly uninformed answer to your expectation.
Anyone? Yes. Anyway, please.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very excellent discourse on policy. We know that the policies are made when social issue is brought on the political. But what we have observed in last 1 and 2 decades, that the policies are not brought on political agenda through the interest of the social class. It has been brought abruptly on the political agenda by considering the electoral prospects. And what happened in the last 2 years in India, that all the policies are directed to electoral prospects. One. Second, policies have always been influenced by corporate sector in 2 ways. The government has considered the corporate sector as the engine of growth, and at the same time, the corporate sector has been very fruitful for the political actors in shape of bonds or whatsoever. We have seen that policies have been undertaken without considering the environment, social classes, but only the electoral prospect, and that too immediate electoral prospect. So far democracy is concerned, a sea of change has taken place in the working of Indian democracy also. And every decision is taken in despotic way, but under the garb of democratic framework. And I remember one English scholar, Colin Crouch, who has termed it as post-democracy. That in post-democracy, the decisions are taken despotically, but have always been presented as taken as democratic. So now the situation has come back. In India, policies, idea path of making policies have been vanishing as well. And what has come that the only political and partisan political gain, whichever the party is in power, doesn't matter. I seek your comment.
May you introduce yourself?
This is Ravindra Kumar Verma. I am R.K. Verma and retired from Bihar University as Associate Professor in Political Science. And presently, I am Secretary of Indian Institute of Public Administration, ADRI.
Ravindra, I cannot disagree with you very much that electoral prospects have become very important. And the only difference is, I am quite pessimistic about current prospects. But think about it like this. In the past, a lot of people voted for this dispensation because they wanted a strong leader and a strong party. And today, many of those people are regretting. Right? Now you have a strong leader. In those days, they did not think that coalition politics and checks and balances are actually good. See, when the Supreme Court cancelled the 144 telecom licenses, we thought that we have a weak practice. And Mr. Dr. Manmohan Singh said that history will judge me more beneficial. Not that he was, I mean, he made a lot of mistakes in my opinion. I've also been critical of it. But, you know, when we had more political competition, I have a feeling that overall, if you look at the checks and balances matrix, you know, there was much greater possibility for the Supreme Court to function. There was much greater possibility for the regulatory institutions. But today, the manner in which, for example, Reliance Jio has more than 30% of market share actually tells me that the telecom regulator has declined from the days of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. You know, Arun Shourie and Atal Bihari Vajpayee took some of the best decisions on Indian telecom.
So in a small, these are subjective assessments, or is there a methodology to do that?
No, there is. I can get it. I know the telecom should be very good. If you look
Somebody
at,
might come up and say that he knows better.
No,
So
no.
distinguish between two.
no. I'll tell you. Let us have an objective indicator,
Yes, correct.
which is how, let's say, quality of services, price, and market power. Who gets licenses how, right? So, if you look at the 1990s, it is a story of private players being largely hit by government players. In the 2000s, Reliance's first attempt was the WLL crisis, to get a cheap license to win market share. It's a very complicated story. I will take you up to dinner time because I know these subjects. But the regulator was able to penalize Reliance for having violated the law. And that penalty was such that Reliance actually never came out. Reliance never was on the losing side of the regulatory game as an affected party. It was like whenever the level playing field was made level, they could never reach a monopoly. Now, how has Jio come to where it is today? Firstly, there is a firm called Infotel, which became the front company of Jio, to which they got cheap internet license. That cheap internet license was converted into a telecom license. They got very cheap license. Then, in telecom parlance, they were able to do predatory pricing. They were able to keep free calls using their other monopoly power to such an extent that no other telecom company has ever succeeded in. And finally, there is something called interconnection. Like when you call from one, you know, if you're a big player, you get revenue when others call you. The interconnection rates were reduced as Reliance's market power increased. So in this way, you can actually fairly objectively argue how the monopoly power of a firm can be increased through regulatory privileges. So, for example,
In economics, what we see is that monopoly appears in the market competition and that leads to a suboptimal outcome. That can be a possibility. But if you allow me a related question related to the slide.
no, there are two things I want to say. One is that under Vajpayee, a similar attempt was made to the WLS price.
So we do read these corporate stories and some might have.
No, these are not corporate stories.
These are
Published in the
background
Journal of Asian Studies, there's a World Bank consultation. This is not like the Hindustan Times story.
But I have a question.
No,
related question.
I would also like to add another point. After I presented that paper to the World Bank, I was actually called to the think tank of the paper when I was a lecturer in a.
That kind of.
So what I- no, that's important. No, that's important because this is how monopoly power is made. I mean, even if you read Stigler and Posner, the great economists who want, how are monopolies made? Monopolies are made when regulators who can produce competition are under Vajpayee, I am saying, another BJP prime minister, the regulator was very powerful. Under Pradeep Bajal, and I have written on this in electorate journal. And when I was writing these stories, Reliance even wanted to take it as a. Today, nobody can stop Reliance. So you are encouraging monopoly power in a way consistent with what you were saying. That has no checks. You could check the 2G scam. Why? Because the Supreme Court was very powerful, then 144 licenses were cancelled. But today, in the 5G license case, Reliance has got the 700 megahertz spectrum in every cycle, in every circle of this country. And that is the most precious spectrum. So the point I'm trying to make is that, in relation to Ravindraji's question, is that if you don't have checks and balances in politics, then the problems that you are talking about become even more. But sorry, now your question.
Question is related to slide. Second last slide. Just one.
I have to some of the 4:30. 3 minutes for the question. 3 minutes.
No, only 1 minute. Some clarification. Kind of clarification related to one of the. I think the second last slide related to attacking state and the society. There were two classifications. Yeah. And the 3 columns there. I think become trade, here and displacement. So I guess as a student, if I look at any policy change, can be categorized into either trade, here or the displacement. Any event, political event or the policy too. So methodologically speaking, is there a objective method to argue that okay, this qualifies in the section of displacement, this qualifies in the section of here, like 3-4 policies you have outlined. I may agree, but some not agree that like Article 370 or CAA. So coming into layer. So how do I distinguish these two views, keeping in the mind that there is a majoritarian electoral partition?
Excellent question. So my answer would be that I am only giving you what are concepts? Concepts are classificatory schemes, right? So I'm giving you a classificatory scheme. Now there are 2 things. Does your empirical data fit with that scheme? On that we can have a debate. But what I'm saying is that this is, and I'm also not saying that this was given by Catherine Cullen, but I mean it's like Newton's laws. If they didn't discover it, somebody else discovered it, it would still be Newton's laws, right? So this is a classificatory scheme where, and we can have a debate. Somebody can say UAPA was displacement. Somebody can say abrogation of Article 370 is not displacement. We can have a debate on that. But what I have just tried to combine as an analytic is when you find ideas moving in opposition to pluralism in state and society, you can have a typology of paths which could be institutional movements. Because we're really looking at institutional change, right? So when you have a Citizenship Amendment Act, now it may just be layering because it's not such a big thing. A lot of people can say that, look, things like this used to happen in the past, now it's only an act. So you can call it layering because it's not such a big leap. But that, of course, depends on how you interpret the empirical data. So I would be open to such debates. And, I am not the authority on every law, right? So let's say I interpreted something different, incorrect, I would be open to arguments, and I would certainly, if better arguments were made, I would put it in daring or in drifts. So I think that's an excellent thing. But what I'm giving you is a typology, and what the typology does is tell you a path. But what I'm saying is also not that the path tells you everything. What tells you everything is the idea, which is attack on pluralism. So a lot of people who are historical materialists, they just look at paths and they pretend as if nothing exists. But what I'm saying is that ideas exist.
Sir, is there any question?
No.
No?
Someone how do you see Delhi's development
What
and
is capital? Sir, I have a very small objection.
Sure. Please. Please go ahead. And you didn't introduce yourself. Who are you?
I'm Suhansu.
You work here.
Yeah, please associate with Fred.
I'm Mayal Das. I must congratulate you first of all that you have delivered very analytical, enlightening, and thought-provoking paper. Naturally, it requires a lot of debate. But I have simply to say that in fact, policy largely depends on the political will. But it's not only political will. There are several other factors also which intervenes into it. And number two, there is a huge gap between the policy and implementation. At the grassroots level, we observe that even if the policy is very good, but its tardy implementation does not result into the required result, required development. So if you look into the development perspective, policy must be evaluated from both the point of view, the strength and weakness of the policy, the strength and weakness of the implementation process. Then only, as per my perception, the picture can emerge. This is the only humble solution or observation to say.
System
No, I entirely agree with you, and that is why you will see that my presentation was closer to implementation than policy. So I could have given a presentation on Indian Telecom because, as you can see, I talk a lot and I get bored you to death. Ask me to be quiet. So when we're looking at the reforms of 1991, no matter how tardy you might say was the implementation, the fact of the matter is that in the early years of this millennium, our growth rate surpassed China's. If you're looking generically, let's say at NREGS and others, you will find that our public expenditure on welfare had increased by historic standards. When we are looking at, let's say, the success of Andhra Pradesh and the failure of West Bengal, we are actually looking at development outcomes. And I'm saying that even state capacity, what you're saying, implementation, political science for state capacity, depends to a very great extent on ideas. So I agree with you that we should go closer to implementation. But closer to implementation does not mean that we just need a more technically sophisticated bureaucracy. Closer to implementation means what is your bureaucracy and political class buying into? Is it buying into Hindu nationalism? Is it buying into secularism? Is it buying into export promotion? Is it buying into import substitution? Is it buying into programmatic policies? Is it just trying to serve some clients? This is very, very important. But I certainly agree with you that we should be looking at implementation. That's why my papers are on states which succeeded and did not succeed. It's not on how NREGS was legislated, it's on why it was implemented. But I think that question is very, very
Will it make sense if I say that if a policy is followed by proper implementation, it's a policy first. They decided they did what it said. In contrast to policies which are not followed by implementation. And there is every reason to suspect that those policies are for what we call image building. They are not serious. If the state is powerful, they can practically implement any policy they want. Absolutely. In spite of the limitations of the state. So if the policy is not followed by proper implementation, I would suspect it was not a policy. Yeah, it was a policy only for image building, not for their own, from their heart. That's
no, and that is exactly what my West Bengal example is. That in fact, the left front government even forced Mrs. Sonia Gandhi to put something at the central level. But when it came to implementing on the ground, they removed Shubhakant Mishra from the land reform ministry. And then they did things like Singhu. So I completely agree with this approach that if the political will is there, then it can be done. And therefore, from the perspective of your question, which is implementation, political will is which is what I'm calling power. But let's say you have a very good politician, but he has a very bad, then it will have an impact. But actually the politician's will or the political power behind the policy is very, very important. Yes. But to answer exactly the kinds of questions that you want to answer, which is, what I'm saying is that everybody says that rationality produces results. I'm saying what kind of rationality? Hindu nationalism is one rationality. Closed economy is one rationality. Open economy is another rationality. State has to buy into that rationality and implement certain things that open system plays. So I'm problematizing the question of rationality itself by bringing in policy paradigms. But I completely agree that if the political class agrees. I mean, for example, for Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, transforming telecommunications is very important, and he did. I mean, he wanted MTNL in 6 cities. He was able to do it in 2 cities. And it was so controversial that after he lost his political power, BSNL 500,000 employees went on strike because MTNL employees were given 100 rupees bonus. This became such a critical issue at the time of Chandrasekhar government that they went to McKinsey for consulting how to get out of this problem. McKinsey recommended a man called Athreya, who was a professor at the IIM in Calcutta. And Athreya wrote a report. If you read Athreya's report, you will find that I met Athreya. I said, how could you say in 1990 what was going to happen to the telecom sector? But you have people like that who know the sector so well that they can almost think like God. And if political power comes together with those people, you can produce good results. But we have to think like that. If we don't think like that, then this community, that community, as you said, winning elections. So I do want to end with an optimistic note, nevertheless.
Friends, I think you all will agree with me. The last 1 hour 40 minutes has been one of the best time in recent history of our nation. We haven't had good seminars as Dr. Mukherji gave us. I'm extremely thankful to Rahul, and I do expect if you come to Patna again, I'll be on your right. With these words, I thank you again, and thank you all.
It's been a wonderful experience for me. This is like coming back to my birthplace after many years, and I really want to keep coming back. Thank you very much.